Hello everyone and welcome to the first lesson in this course. So in this lesson, we're going to look at some of the basic operations within Inkscape, and in particular the select tool, which also is a transformation tool, as we'll see. So in order to get started, let's use the rectangle tool to make a simple rectangle so we can start to manipulate it. So by basically clicking and dragging, you can make a rectangle. And one thing you'll notice is that my cursor is still in the rectangle mode and the rectangle is still selected, as you can see. So whatever operation I do next is also going to be making rectangles. So I'm going to undo by doing Control Z a few times, and that'll get rid of those rectangles I just created. If I click on the rectangle, you'll notice that there's a rectangle, a square icon there, and a little one here, and a circle there. This tells me that I'm in the edit mode of this object. And to get out of the edit mode, I select the select tool. And as you can see, the rectangle changes into a selection. And in this mode, the select mode, I can grab the rectangle and move it around. I can also grab these handles and change the size of my object. Now, if I click on the object a second time, you'll see that my arrows on the outer edge have now changed into these semicircles, which means that the transformations that I can do now are different than I could do before. So now I could actually rotate the object by grabbing those handles, and I can also deform the object. So this is the second form of the select tool. If I click again, I go back to the first version of the select tool, which was more of the scaling. So there are two modes in the select tool. The first one, as shown here, is the scale mode, the scaling version. And if I click a second time, I get into the rotation mode. Now, if I double click, you notice I'm back to these icons, the squares, and I'm back in the edit mode. So let's go through that again. This is the select mode. Let's call it mode 1. Select mode 2. And by double clicking, I go back to the edit mode where I can edit the object. Next, I'm going to select the object and delete it simply by pressing on the delete button on the keyboard. And I want to show you that depending on the tool that's selected here, your options in this area will change. So the select tool gives you these options, the rectangle tool gives you these options, and so on. Next, let's suppose that we want to make a rectangle that's exactly 5 inches by 10 inches. So there are a few ways to do this. First, select a rectangle, and you could see that we have some options here. The width and the height are grayed out, and that's because we haven't made a rectangle yet. But as soon as we make any shape, you could see now that we have access to these forms. And we can simply type in 5 by 10, and I'm pressing tab, or you can press enter, and you could see that we've made an exact rectangle of 5 by 10 inches. I'm going to select the select tool, and when you do that, you'll see that up here we now have dimensions of the selected object. In this case, they're in centimeters, but if I put them back into inches, we could see that we're at 5 by 10 inches. And now we also have the option here to make modifications. So let's say we want 6 by 12, and you can see we've done that all through the select tool. So now I want to go back into the edit mode so I can edit the corners of this rectangle. And if you remember, you simply double click on the object and you enter the edit mode. In the edit mode for the rectangle, you'll notice that there's a circle here. And if you grab that circle and pull it down, what you're doing is you're changing the curvature, in this case, of the vertical axis. And you can also change the curvature of the horizontal axis to give you any shape that you want. The square icons here give you access to the dimensions on the X and Y axes. So you can edit the object as you wish, and you can make a square into a circle and vice versa. Now, to go back to the selection mode, there's a few ways to do it. One is I can go back in here and click on the select icon. Another way is to hit the escape key on the keyboard. And yet a third way is to press F1. And as you'll become more familiar with Inkscape, you'll notice that many of the tools and menu items have multiple ways to activate them. So in this case, I'm going to press escape twice, and I'm back in the selection mode. Now, changing the curvature of a rectangle becomes useful in things like making electronic cavity covers, for example, for like a Telecaster electronic cavity cover. And if I had the dimensions on hand, I would be able to type them in here. But we don't necessarily want it to be blue, which brings me to the topic of colors. Now, within Inkscape, there are two modes of colors. One is the fill mode, which fills the area enclosed by an object, and the other is called the stroke, which basically is the outline of the object. And those two things can be operated independently. So, being in my selection mode, I highlight the item, and by simply clicking on any color in the color palette, you can see that I'm affecting the fill of that object. So if I wanted to fill the object with black, I can choose the black, and right next to that is this special color, which is basically none. So by clicking that, it removes any color fill. Now, if I wanted to change the color of the stroke, which again is the color of the line, I have to hold down the Shift key and then select the color. As you can see, my line is a little bit thin, but by holding down the Shift key, I'm changing the color of the stroke. And if I remove my finger from the Shift key and select a color, then I'm filling the area of the object. And notice that down here, the current fill color and the current stroke colors are labeled down here. As I changed the stroke color, you could see that the stroke color status is also changing, and similarly for the fill color as I change the fill color. Now, the last thing I want to cover in this video is the zoom command, which can be accessed through this icon, pressing F3, or you can also press the Z key on the keyboard, which is what I'll do now. As I do that, you'll see that my icon has now turned into a magnifying glass with a plus sign on it. So if I click with my mouse, you'll see that I'm zooming in further and further. If I want to zoom out, I press the Shift key, and you can see that the zoom icon now has a minus sign on it, And if I click the mouse, I'll zoom out. While in the zoom command, you can also drag the cursor, and that'll zoom in the area of the selection. If you're more comfortable with the keyboard, you can also press the minus key, as I'm doing now, or the plus key to zoom in and out. Yet even more options. While you're in the zoom command, you'll see that you have many options up here, and these ones here are predefined zoom ratios that you can play with. Okay, so we've covered a little bit of ground in this first lesson, and now I want you to perform this exercise. I want you to recreate what I've drawn here, which is my latest guitar design. Now, using only the rectangle tool and the select tool, you should be able to recreate this. And I want you to make the body 4 inches by 8 inches, the neck 1 inch by 8 inch, and the headstock 2.5 inches by about 4 inches. And I want you to curve the body sides and also curve the headstock sides, but leave the rectangle square. And I also want you to change the color of each of these 3 items, both in the fill and on the stroke. And lastly, for bonus points, try to figure out how to make this 8-sided star. Hint, it's one of the icons in here. See you in the next lesson.